Some people are just meant to be part of a tag team. Take someone like Road Dogg, for example, or even Road Warrior Animal. Sure, they've each had solo runs in the past, but it just wasn't the same without their partners there. That said, there have been times when great tag teams have split up, and it's led to the people involved reaching even bigger heights. But what are the biggest examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with one of the biggest examples of this phenomenon, and that's Edge and Christian. Yes, while they may have been on top of the world in Turn of the Millennium WWF as a duo, a team so good they won all 3 of the TLC Triangle Ladder matches, which made the era famous. Once Edge and Christian parted ways in 2001, things reached a whole new level for the pair. And that's because now solo acts for the first time, they were able to give fans something different. And this led to Edge in particular reaching massive levels of success which all began with him winning the King of the Ring that same year. But it wouldn't end there for the rated R superstar, because just a few years after this, he'd win the inaugural Money in the Bank contract, then go on to successfully cash this in against John Cena at January 8, 2006's New Year's Revolution pay-per-view. Then, once that reign came to an end, he'd win the top prize a further 10 times before all was said and done, with him spending a large portion of this part of his career as the face of SmackDown. Sure, it might have taken Christian a little bit longer to reach the same heights, as Vince McMahon never really saw as much in him for whatever reason, but he'd get there eventually too. He'd just have to leave WWE in order to do so for the most part, and that's because, prior to his 2 brief World Heavyweight title runs on SmackDown saw him threaten to break through to the main event full-time, he'd move over to TNA, where he had a great run there, and became a World Heavyweight Champion a further 3 times over. Then there's also his current run with All Elite Wrestling, where he's reached a whole new level of great heel work altogether. But the Canadian isn't the only person this has happened to over the years, as 2 of Edge and Christian's greatest rivals during the Attitude Era also had a similar career trajectory when they went solo. Who are we talking about here? Why, the Hardy Boys, of course. That's right. Well, as a pair, the brothers from North Carolina reached heights few could ever have foreseen for them. As solo acts, they arguably did even more. After all, each of them were at various points able to reach the top of the card by themselves, and the first to do this was Jeff, as following the first breakup of the Hardys in 2002, he went on to become a main event player over on Raw for a while, with him at one point getting to have a particularly memorable ladder match with The Undertaker over the WWE Undisputed title. Sadly though, he wouldn't win this one. No, his big moment wouldn't come until a few years later when, after reaching such levels of popularity with fans that he was starting to outsell John Cena at the merch stands, he'd defeat both Triple H and Edge to win the WWE Championship for the first time at December 14th, 2008's Armageddon pay-per-view. As for Matt's journey post-breakup of the Hardys, like with Christian Cage, he'd take a little bit longer to get there. But once he did, he'd arguably be a bigger star because of this. And that's because when he finally did come up with a main event gimmick while working for Impact, a gimmick that went by the name of Broken Matt Hardy, it changed the entire industry in many ways. How could this be true? Well, his pioneering use of the cinematic style of match would become a lifesaver for many promotions just a few years later during the lockdown. And the deep lore he built around his whole Pocket Hardy universe certainly inspired others like Bray Wyatt to do the same with The Fiend. Hell, because of the great work he's done over the last decade, you could now argue he's the bigger of the 2 siblings in terms of star power. And that's something no one would have ever imagined could have been true back in the days when the charismatic enigma was all anyone wanted to talk about. So it just goes to show the positive impact a well-timed split can have for a tag team, as it can lead to all people involved becoming superstars in their own right. Still need more evidence of what we're telling you is true? Well then, let's cast our minds back in time a little to 2014, as it was then The Shield broke up after an 18-month run on top. But while this could have been a disaster, as when the trio of Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, and Dean Ambrose were nigh on unstoppable, it ended up being the best thing that could have happened to them, as each has since gone on to dominate the industry in their own way. In fact, if you look at the major leagues of North America today, it's pretty much an image of the Hounds of Justice being above everyone else. It doesn't matter if it's Raw, where Seth Rollins is the king of the brand as the current World Heavyweight Champion, SmackDown, where Roman Reigns has held the undisputed WWE Universal title for going on 4 years now, or AEW, where the now renamed Jon Moxley is a record 3-time world champion and undisputed ace of the company. The Shield have dominated everywhere they've gone. And given they're all still in their 30s, it doesn't look like that domination is going to end anytime soon, even if we never get to see them all in a ring together at the same time again. Really, you could argue that in the modern day, there's no better example of a breakup done right, as this one took 3 guys who were relative nobodies just over 2 years before and drove them to the absolute biggest heights of the wrestling industry. Hell, so dominant have they been, there was even one night at June 19th, 2016's Money in the Bank pay-per-view where they all held the world title within 10 minutes of each other. And none of this would have happened had they not gone their separate ways and explored what they could be as solo acts. Just as our next subjects could never have reached the same heights had they not done the same thing in 1993. That's right, it's time to talk about the Hollywood Blondes. Stone Cold Steve Austin, arguably the biggest star the wrestling industry has ever created. Brian Pillman, one of the greatest and most groundbreaking gimmicks that ever was. It might be hard for younger fans that weren't there at the time to believe, but these two legends were actually once a tag team. Yes, back in 1992, before Austin became the Rattlesnake and before Pillman became the Loose Cannon, the two were a pair of rookies looking for their big break. And that big break came when WCW, their employer at the time, decided to match them up. Why was this such a good thing for their careers? Well, because they quickly learned that they had excellent chemistry together, and so used it to take themselves to the next level. Sadly though, tag team wrestling in WCW was always going to have an upper limit, and that was why, no matter how over they got in their new role, there was always going to be a ceiling involved. Luckily, the singles division had no such ceiling, however, and that was why, once the pair were broken up in October of 1993, they were able to go to places they never could have imagined ahead of time. Obviously for Austin in particular, this meant the absolute apex of the industry, as from 1997 onwards, he was the hottest thing in wrestling. Someone so over, he dragged everyone around him into a new boom period of popularity. And while Brian Pillman never reached quite the same heights by himself, that's not to say he wasn't hugely important in his own way as his Loose Cannon character, a character which shattered the line between kayfabe and reality, was so influential people are still heavily cribbing from it today. In fact, you could argue the likes of CM Punk's pipe bomb in 2011 might never have happened had it not been for the groundwork the Ohio native was laying for such things back in the 90s. Sadly though, Pillman never got to live long enough to see the true depths of his influence as he'd die in October of 1997 of a heart attack. But at least he lives on in his son, current NXT star Lexis King. And if we've learned anything over the years, it's that NXT can be a great place for someone to develop, whether that be as a tag team or a solo act, something evident in the saga of DIY during the mid-2010s. Yes, perhaps the greatest story the Black and Gold brand has ever told, the rise and fall of DIY had audiences gripped back during the glory days of NXT, as it was everything people had been begging for in a great angle under the WWE banner for years. After all, it featured friendship, betrayal, and revenge in spades. So what wasn't there to love? And it also allowed each man involved, Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa, to enter the next phases of their careers, as while they had been successful as a double act, so successful they became NXT Tag Team Champions together at one point. Once they separated, they went on to have one of the greatest programs in modern history, with this one seeing each man hold the developmental brand's world title before it was all said and done. In fact, Ciampa would have held the top prize on 2 separate occasions by the time his run on NXT was over, showing just how good of a thing the split was for him in the long run. And while he'd only win the big one once, Gargano successfully offset this by becoming a record 3-time North American champion. Then, as if that weren't enough, once Triple H took over as head of creative, each man would be called up to the main roster where they continue to ply their craft to this day on Raw. And sure, they might not have reached the same heights as they did on Tuesday nights yet, but give them time, as they're still only getting started, and who knows what the future will hold. Will it see them revive their legendary rivalry all over again for a new audience? It's entirely possible, just as it's also possible they'll each win some main roster gold in the not too distant future. But then they wouldn't be the first to do such a thing, because the template for finding success as a team on the third brand, then going it solo on the main roster thereafter, was already created years ago back in the late 2000s when the Miz and John Morrison were a thing. That's right, we've come to the part of the video where we once again argue that The Miz does not, in fact, suck. Rather, he's actually quite underrated. No, he isn't Bryan Danielson in the ring, and he never will be. But if you look at the WWE roster over the last couple of decades, you'll be hard-pressed to find a more reliable all-rounder who can fit into any role Vince McMahon asks of him and do it without complaining. Then, when it comes to John Morrison, you're talking about a guy who has such an eye-catching offensive style, such a crowd-pleasing manner, that it's impossible not to turn your attention towards him whenever he's on screen. and that's why he's had plenty of solo successes of his own over the years, including runs with the top prize in the likes of WWECW, Impact, AAA, and Lucha Underground. Would this have happened if they hadn't first pooled the resources by teaming up together for a while? That's impossible to say. But we can say for sure that their time as a duo certainly helped them in the long run, as it allowed them an opportunity to develop their acts with the safety of knowing they had someone else to fall back on if things bombed. And because of that, once they went their separate ways in 2011, there was no more fear of bombing, as each man knew they had it in them to reach the stars, and boy did they ever do this. In the case of The Miz in particular, in fact, he'd actually win the WWE title later that same year, with this only being his first of 2 reigns with that particular belt. And while John Morrison may never have reached the same heights in WWE, as we mentioned a moment ago, he's certainly been no stranger to collecting world titles in other parts of the world. Even today, the pair still hold spots on the rosters of the 2 biggest wrestling companies in North America, with The Miz continuing to be a presence in WWE, and Morrison now working alongside his wife Taya Valkyrie in AEW. Does this mean we'll never see them together again? Maybe, but given how successful they were after their first split, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Just as it wasn't a bad thing when our next subjects chose to never reunite after they parted ways in 1989. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Strikeforce? Don't remember Strikeforce off the top of your head? We wouldn't blame you if you didn't, because their run together stretches all the way back to the days of Golden Era WWF, an eternity ago in wrestling terms. And it was during this period that, while the roster was arguably never more stacked with star power in the singles division, Tito Santana and Rick Martel attempted to stand out by instead pairing up for a while. As time went on, however, it became clear each man had aspirations of being a single star, and this is what ultimately led to them breaking up in 1989 after Martel turned heel on his partner. But then maybe this was a good thing in the long run as far as both parties were concerned, because once they were on their own, each found that they had it in them to be as single stars in New York all along, with Tito Santana going on to become a 2-time Intercontinental Champion and 1-time King of the Ring, and Rick Martel morphing into the Model, one of the best heels of the late Golden Era period. Of course, it really shouldn't have come as a surprise that they had this in them though, especially in the case of Martel, as prior to joining WWF, he'd already been an AWA World Champion. That said, just being a great wrestler wasn't enough in itself to get you over in the 80s WWF, and so that's why he first had to find his character with Santana before he could reach the next level. And that character ended up carrying him all the way into the early 90s, as he got to have feuds with the likes of Shawn Michaels right at the time as his former tag partner was continuing to go strong in the new gimmick of El Matador for a while, a gimmick which would help him to ultimately get a WWE Hall of Fame inclusion in 2004. But Strikeforce weren't the only great team of this era who went on to have even more success after they split, because at around the same time, another pair were going through something similar, and that's the US Express. Who were the US Express? Well, they were the duo made up of real-life brothers-in-law Barry Windham and Mike Rotunda, and as a duo, they were able to dominate the tag division prior to even making it to WWF, as before this, they were actually 3-time NWA United States Tag Team Champions in Championship Wrestling from Florida. Then, once they made the jump over to Vince McMahon's company, they got to have some excellent feuds against the likes of the North-South Connection, the Dream Team, and the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov, all while winning that company's tag team belts on 2 separate occasions. Still though, the real upper limits of their success wouldn't become apparent until after they decided to call it a day in 1987 while working for Bill Watts' Universal Wrestling Federation, as at this point, each would make their mark as a single star. And for Barry Windham in particular, this meant eventually reaching the mountaintop in 1993 when he became NWA World's Champion. Did Mike Rotunda manage to achieve this too? No. But he would get to have a great run post-US Express regardless, as after spending a short spell in WCW, he'd move back over to the WWF where he'd begin playing the character of Irwin R. Shyster, wrestling's resident taxman and tag team partner to the Million Dollar Man, Ted DiBiase. Yes, while he never became a world champion as a solo act, Rotunda did become a tag team champion all over again on 3 separate occasions with DiBiase, proving he got a lot out of the US Express's split too. And even if he is still waiting on joining Windham in the WWE Hall of Fame, he can rest easy knowing that, as the father not only to Bo Dallas, but the late great Bray Wyatt, he was responsible for giving the world one of the biggest stars of the modern era, someone who captured fans' attention in a way few others could while he was still alive. That said, for as big of an impact as the US Express have had on the wrestling industry as a whole, they're not the last team from the 80s we're going to be looking at today. No, our next subjects came from that time period too. And while they did have success together, no one really remembers the Blade Runners for that now, because their solo careers have since overshadowed this part of their careers so much. Not sure who the Blade Runners are? Well, maybe you'll recognize them by their individual names, Steve Borden and Jim Hellwig. That's right, the two men we're talking about here are the same two men who would go on to become Sting and the Ultimate Warrior. And given how seismic they were for their respective companies at WCW and WWE during the late 80s and early 90s, their breakup and subsequent choice to go it alone as solo acts has to rank as one of the best decisions ever made in pro wrestling. After all, while they were certainly able to make their presence felt as a duo back in the mid-80s when they tagged in both the Continental Wrestling Association and Mid-South Wrestling, the success they had there was nothing compared to what would await them, and that's because just a few years later, there was a point in the summer of 1990 when it looked like they were going to become the dominant two solo acts in the business for the coming decade, as Sting was the NWA World Champion in WCW, and the Ultimate Warrior was the World Champion over in the WWF. Sure, Jim Hellwig may have flamed out soon after this, but none of that takes away from the fact that he was able to make it to the top of the wrestling world, even if it was only for a brief time. And when it comes to his former tag team partner, well, he had no issues staying in the main event scene even after his run as world champion came to an end, because over the course of the rest of his career, he'd remain such a big star, he'd win a total of 12 world titles across Jim Crockett Promotions, WCW, and TNA. Hell, even to this day, he's still an active performer for AEW. And with his upcoming retirement coming at March 3rd, 2024's Revolution pay-per-view, he'll no doubt continue to be one of the most talked about people in the industry next year too. Really, you could argue that no other team has seen their respective members go on to have the levels of success the Blade Runners did after they split up. But then it's not all about winning multiple world titles, of course. No, sometimes the optimum thing which can come from a tag team split is that a performer gets a chance to remind people that they can be a great singles act. And this is what happened to both Bobby Roode and James Storm when Beer Money Inc. parted ways in 2011. Yes, we're venturing back over to the Impact Zone now, as this is where one of the best teams of the late 2000s and 2010s made their name. And that team first came about when solo acts Roode and Storm decided to join forces in 2008 over their shared love of two things, beer and money. What followed on from there then was magic, as over the next 3 years, Beer Money Inc. became 4-time tag team champions in the then Nashville-based company. At a certain point, however, even all the success they were having together wasn't enough. And so this was why they'd end up going their own separate ways once more in the autumn of 2011, with them at this point feuding over the TNA World title. And once that feud was over and both men were free to go their own separate ways again, they found themselves even bigger solo stars than they had been before. In fact, from 2011 to the present day, they've won a total of 4 world titles between them across Impact and NXT. But then that's what happens whenever a tag team has a successful split. They go on to even greater things than they ever could have if they were still together.